The late afternoon sun rested softly over the small town, giving everything a gentle glow as people walked toward the community center. It was one of those places where time seemed to move slower, where faces were familiar and routines stayed the same. The center was preparing for a yearly charity event, something the town looked forward to because it brought everyone together, even ones who usually kept to themselves. Volunteers arranged chairs, checked lights, and practiced small parts of the program. There was laughter here and there, small conversations floating around like warm air. It felt peaceful in a simple way most people appreciated. Among the volunteers moving quietly around the room was an older nun. She had been helping at the center for as long as anyone could remember. She never looked for attention. She just showed up, did her work with steady hands, and offered a kind smile to anyone who needed it. People respected her, but they didn't think much about her life beyond the walls of the center. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, and she rarely talked about herself. Most assumed her days were plain and predictable. That was why the joke started in the first place. A small group of regulars gathered near the front, where an old piano stood. Its wood was worn from age, and some keys had tiny chips along the edges. It had been sitting on the stage for years, mostly untouched except for holiday events when someone would play a simple tune. That afternoon, as the volunteers cleaned around it, one outspoken man pointed at the piano and said with a smirk, "If she plays that thing, I'll atone for every bad habit I've got." People laughed, partly because the joke felt harmless and partly because it seemed impossible. The idea of the quiet nun sitting at a piano and playing anything more than a basic note felt unbelievable to them. She was gentle and humble, nothing like someone with a dramatic talent hidden away. The louder ones repeated the joke, adding new twists every time. Soon the joke became a little running theme among the volunteers. None of this reached her ears. She was folding tablecloths at the far side of the room, humming a small tune under her breath, unaware that her name was part of a challenge that others found amusing. She simply continued her tasks, moving between tables and checking that everything looked neat for the evening. Even though the joke was lighthearted, one person in the group didn't feel entirely right about it. A younger volunteer stood nearby, listening but not laughing. They glanced at the nun from time to time, wondering why people were so sure she didn't have anything special hidden beneath her quiet nature. The town was full of surprises, and sometimes the most unexpected people had the deepest stories. But the louder voices drowned out any second thoughts. The community center buzzed with small preparations. Someone tested the microphone. Another person taped a loose wire to the stage floor. People moved chairs around, arguing lightly about which row should go where. There was a warm kind of chaos, the kind that comes before a good event. And through all of it, the piano sat untouched, almost watching the room with silent patience. The nun walked past it once, carrying a stack of candles meant for the donation table. She paused for a brief moment, looking at the instrument with soft eyes. It wasn't long enough for anyone to notice, but for a second, something gentle and distant passed over her face. Then she continued on her way. Meanwhile, the group near the front kept the joke alive. "Maybe she used to play in secret concerts," one of them said, pretending to wipe tears from laughing too much. Another added, "Imagine her playing better than anyone else in town." They all knew they were exaggerating, and that made it funnier to them. The outspoken man repeated his bold claim again, louder this time, as if declaring it gave it more weight. "If she plays even one real song, I swear I'll atone. Every mistake I've made, I'll try to fix it." People chuckled again, though some were beginning to feel the joke stretching thin. But the man enjoyed being the center of attention, and so he kept it going. It was easy entertainment on a slow afternoon. Outside, the sky shifted to a deeper orange. More volunteers arrived, and the sound of chatter grew. The program list for the charity event was taped to the wall. A few speakers, a small performance from local kids, and a music slot that hadn't been filled yet. They had been looking for someone to play a piece or two, but no one had come forward. Most people in town could play something, but not confidently enough to perform in front of others. When the organizer walked through the hall, they noticed the empty slot again and sighed. There was still time, but not much. They needed a musician. A few more people came near the piano, some touching the keys lightly, making thin sounds that floated in the air for a second before disappearing. Still, no one seriously considered playing. The older nun walked past again, and this time the younger volunteer noticed her glance toward the piano. Not long, not bold, but enough to spark a tiny seed of curiosity. But the rest of the volunteers remained unaware of her quiet connection to the instrument. To them, she was just the calm, mild-mannered helper who stacked chairs and carried donation boxes without a complaint. The evening's planning wrapped up slowly. People began leaving in small groups, some still repeating the joke as they stepped outside. The outspoken man made the joke one last time before heading out, laughing as though he had created the highlight of the day. The piano sat in its place, untouched again, holding on to whatever secrets remained inside its silent frame. As the crowd thinned, the nun helped clean the last few corners of the room. She moved without rush, even though she had already spent hours there. Her steps were steady, her hands sure. She left the community center only when all the tasks were done, stepping into the calm evening with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need attention to feel content. No one knew that the joke made in the room would soon take a direction no one expected. No one knew that the piano, ignored for so long, would soon become the center of something unforgettable. And no one imagined that the quiet woman they thought they understood had a past they had never taken the time to explore. But the moment was coming. The people who laughed would soon fall silent. The outspoken man who made the bold promise would soon find himself standing face to face with his own words. And the piano, old and worn, would soon speak with a voice that none of them could forget. Part 1 ends with the gentle shift of evening settling into the town, while the story prepares to take its first unexpected turn. The community center becomes quiet again, the piano watching over an empty room, waiting for the moment when its keys would no longer be silent. The next morning, the community center was quiet again, the buzz of volunteers replaced by the gentle hum of sunlight filtering through the windows. The nun arrived early, as she often did, moving with careful steps and a sense of purpose that went unnoticed by most. She carried her usual small basket of supplies, placing it gently on a side table, and began her routine without a word to anyone. The air smelled faintly of polish and old wood, and the piano at the front of the room seemed almost alive in the soft light, the keys gleaming faintly as if waiting for a touch. A newcomer had arrived in town just a week before, and curiosity had led them to the community center. They were observing everything with quiet interest, learning about the routines and small interactions that kept the place alive. It was their first time seeing the nun in person, and something about her calm movements and gentle demeanor drew their attention. Unlike others who laughed at the idea of her playing the piano, this newcomer noticed a subtle pause each time she passed the instrument. She lingered for the briefest moment, fingers brushing against the polished edge as if remembering something long forgotten. The newcomer hesitated before speaking to anyone, not wanting to disturb the flow of activity. But as the morning went on, they began to feel an unspoken story behind the quiet nun. People chatted lightly, moved chairs, dusted surfaces, and occasionally glanced at the piano. But the conversation always circled back to the joke from yesterday. The outspoken man had returned, still laughing to himself and repeating the words, "If she plays even one song, I will atone." His friends laughed along, shaking their heads in disbelief at the idea of the nun performing. The newcomer wondered silently why so many doubted her. There was a depth in her eyes, a sense of patience and experience that suggested there might be more than met the eye. They watched her kneel briefly to adjust a chair and noticed her hands were strong but gentle, the kind that could move gracefully across anything she touched. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, an awareness of space and sound that hinted at something beyond ordinary skill. Throughout the morning, whispers and stories from the past began to surface. One of the older volunteers mentioned in passing that the nun had once been trained in music long before she joined the convent. Others shrugged, unsure if it was true or just a rumor passed down by those who had known her longer. The newcomer's curiosity deepened. There was a story here waiting to be told, one that the town had never truly explored. Yet, even with this small spark of revelation, most of the regulars continued their teasing. The joke seemed safer than curiosity, and the comfort of laughter outweighed any interest in the nun's true abilities. The day passed slowly, punctuated by the arrival of more volunteers who set up tables for the upcoming charity event. Each person had a task, a small responsibility that made the room feel alive with movement. The nun worked steadily alongside them, her quiet presence grounding the energy in the room. She arranged chairs in perfect rows, folded tablecloths with precise care, and offered a smile to anyone who looked her way. The newcomer noticed how she spoke little, but when she did, her words were thoughtful, deliberate, and filled with warmth. As the afternoon approached, a few more people wandered near the piano, tempted by its presence but still hesitant to touch the keys. The nun moved past it once again, pausing ever so slightly, her fingers resting on the edge as though listening for something only she could hear. The newcomer felt a strange pull, a curiosity about what she might do if given the chance. Yet, no one else seemed to notice, caught up in their laughter and light-hearted speculation. When a volunteer asked the nun if she would consider performing a small piece at the charity event, she hesitated. Her voice was soft but clear as she explained that she hadn't played in years and wasn't sure she could manage a performance in front of others. The newcomer could see the conflict in her eyes, a mix of fear, modesty, and a quiet longing. She wanted to help, to share something she loved, but the weight of the past and her own humility made her pause. The outspoken man overheard this exchange and chuckled. "Well, there you go. If she even touches the keys, I'll finally make good on my promise." The others laughed along, but the atmosphere began to shift slightly. There was something in the way she accepted the invitation that felt genuine, almost sacred. The newcomer's sense of anticipation grew. This was no longer just a joke. It was a moment pregnant with possibility, a quiet tension waiting for release. Throughout the rest of the day, the nun practiced privately. The room was empty except for her and the piano. She touched the keys lightly at first, unsure, as if testing her own memory. Notes sounded soft, almost hesitant, but gradually her fingers found their way, guided by muscles and memories that had been dormant for too long. Each note brought a small smile to her lips, a spark of joy that had been waiting quietly beneath years of routine and quiet service. The newcomer, unable to resist, watched from a distance. They didn't speak or interrupt, simply observed as the nun rediscovered her connection to the instrument. It was a gentle process, unhurried, filled with patience and care. Every note she played seemed to carry a piece of her history, a whisper of all the moments she had lived through, both joyful and sorrowful. The piano, silent for so long, responded to her touch as if it remembered her as well. Meanwhile, the other volunteers continued their preparations, unaware of the transformation taking place in the quiet room. They spoke in bursts of laughter and light chatter, still holding onto the joke, still imagining the impossible. Some glanced toward the piano occasionally, but none could have guessed what was unfolding. As evening approached, the community center took on a calm glow. Lights were arranged, tables decorated, and the faint scent of baked goods filled the air. The nun sat at the piano once more, running her fingers over the keys, feeling the textures and sounds that had been dormant for years. The newcomer felt a sense of awe, recognizing that something profound was quietly taking shape. By the end of the day, the nun had not only practiced but had begun to regain a confidence that surprised even herself. She knew she could play at the charity event at least a simple piece, and the thought of sharing her music with the community brought a quiet sense of excitement. She wasn't playing to prove the doubters wrong. She was playing because it mattered to her, because the music had always been a part of who she was. The newcomer left the community center that evening with a sense of anticipation. They understood that tomorrow would be different, that the quiet nun who moved so gently through the day would soon take the stage in a way no one had imagined. They thought about the outspoken man's words, about the joke that had started it all, and realized that sometimes the most unexpected people carry the deepest truths. Outside, the town settled into night. Lights flickered on in homes, and the gentle hum of evening filled the streets. Inside the community center, the piano rested, waiting, while the nun's hands moved over it one last time before she left. There was a sense of readiness, a quiet promise that something remarkable was about to happen. And though most people still laughed and doubted, the seeds of amazement had already begun to grow. Part 2 ends with the town unaware of the silent preparations taking place. The nun's past and her connection to music remain largely unknown, but the stage is almost set. The newcomer senses the change. The piano holds its breath, and the joke that started the day will soon become a memory overshadowed by the truth of talent, humility, and unexpected courage. The morning of the charity event arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the small town. The community center opened its doors early as volunteers scurried around, putting the finishing touches on decorations and arranging the chairs in neat rows. The sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor and highlighting the old piano at the front of the room. It seemed to glimmer as if aware that the day was about to change everything. The nun entered the center earlier than most, carrying only a small satchel. Her movements were calm, measured, and purposeful. She nodded quietly to a few volunteers as they rushed by, too busy to notice her presence fully. She moved directly to the piano, placing her bag beside it, and for a moment, she just stood there, letting her eyes drift over the keys. Her fingers hovered above them, almost as if she were remembering something she had almost forgotten. The piano, once silent and unassuming, now seemed to hold a promise of transformation. The younger volunteer who had been observing her over the past day arrived next, curious and eager to see what would unfold. They noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor, the way her shoulders seemed to relax and her hands rested lightly on the keys. It was as though she carried decades of history in her touch, waiting for the right moment to be shared. No one else was paying attention, caught up in the last-minute tasks that came with event preparation, unaware that a quiet miracle was unfolding. As the room filled with volunteers and townspeople, the topic of the nun and the piano returned to conversation. Laughter and speculation ran through the air, with the outspoken man repeating his old joke, louder than ever, so everyone could hear. "If she even plays a single song, I'll finally atone for everything." People chuckled nervously, unsure if she would actually perform, or if it was just another harmless rumor. Still, the jest carried a new weight that even they could sense, though none admitted it aloud. The nun's attention remained on the piano. She carefully placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the familiar textures and slight resistance beneath them. Her mind traveled back to earlier days, when she had played with abandon, filling rooms with music that had comforted and inspired those around her. She remembered the lessons, the hours of practice, the small moments of triumph and frustration. All of it had been tucked away in the quiet corners of her life, but now it was returning with gentle insistence. After a long pause, she began to play softly, almost hesitantly. The notes were simple at first, timid, like someone testing waters they hadn't entered in years. A few volunteers passed by and paused, ears perking at the melody that was slowly weaving through the room. No one had expected anything like this. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was subtle, full of emotion, and filled with a warmth that seemed to touch everyone who heard it. The younger volunteer stepped closer, careful not to disturb her, watching as her fingers moved more confidently. Each key pressed brought a sound that was richer than the last, as if the piano itself remembered her touch and welcomed her back. The nun's eyes were closed, focused entirely on the music, and for a moment, the world outside the room seemed to disappear. The chatter and laughter of volunteers faded into silence as the beauty of the sound demanded attention. In the back, the outspoken man stopped mid-conversation, drawn toward the music he had ridiculed so easily the day before. His smile faltered as the notes wrapped around him, soft yet powerful, stirring something he hadn't expected. He glanced at the others, who were also beginning to stop, caught off guard by the sheer emotion of the performance. The joke that had filled the room with laughter only hours before now felt hollow, replaced by awe and reverence. The nun continued, her confidence growing with each passing moment. She played with a subtle strength, a delicate balance between control and freedom. The melody told stories of her life, The quiet moments of service, the hidden struggles, the joys she had quietly savored. People felt it as much as they heard it. Even the youngest child in the room stopped moving, mesmerized by the sound. The room falling into a rare, gentle silence that seemed to stretch on without end. Her music carried a sense of humility and grace, not seeking applause but simply existing to be heard. The piano, long neglected, now sang beneath her touch as if it had been waiting for her all along. The older volunteers, those who had laughed and joked about her abilities, now whispered to each other in astonishment. They had no idea this talent existed, hidden behind years of quiet dedication and simplicity. As the song reached its crescendo, the nun's expression reflected something beyond concentration. It was a deep connection, a merging of memory and present, a reminder of the power of passion nurtured in silence. The final notes lingered in the air, reverberating softly against the walls, and then the room fell completely still. Everyone seemed suspended in that moment, unsure whether to breathe, speak, or even move. It was as though the music had created a bubble around them, separating the world outside from the awe inside. Finally, the applause began, tentative at first, then building as more and more people realized the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The young volunteer clapped vigorously, unable to contain the excitement, and soon the entire room joined in. The outspoken man's hands trembled slightly as he clapped, not from lack of experience, but from an overwhelming sense of humility. He remembered his words, his boast, and realized that the reality had far exceeded his expectations. The nun looked up from the piano, a small smile crossing her face. She did not boast, did not demand praise, but acknowledged the applause with quiet grace. The room was filled with a mixture of admiration, surprise, and respect. People approached her with newfound warmth, some offering thanks, others simply nodding in silent acknowledgement. The music had bridged a gap between perception and reality, revealing the depth of someone they had underestimated. The organizer of the charity event approached her cautiously, almost afraid to break the spell that had filled the room. "That was beautiful," they said simply, "more than anyone could have imagined." She nodded politely, her attention already returning to the piano, her connection to it still lingering. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about the music itself, the gift she had carried quietly and shared without expectation. The outspoken man stepped forward, his expression serious but respectful. "I owe you my word," he said softly. "I said I'd atone if you played. I think I understand now." The nun only smiled, offering a gentle nod, accepting the sincerity without needing anything more. It was a moment of personal change, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest lessons come from unexpected places. People lingered in the room long after the music ended, hesitant to leave the warmth that had been created. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, and tinged with a sense of respect. The nun returned to her usual tasks, arranging chairs and tidying tables, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. She carried herself with the same quiet grace, but the people around her now saw her differently, appreciating the depth that had always been there but never recognized. By the evening, the charity event had begun in earnest, with the atmosphere now lighter, more connected. The piano, once just a piece of furniture, had become a symbol of hidden potential, of quiet strength, and of the impact one person could have without seeking attention. The nun, in her own gentle way, had transformed not only the room but the hearts of everyone present. People left that night carrying a memory that would linger, a story of humility, courage, and the unexpected power of talent nurtured in silence. Part 3 ends with the nun quietly stepping away from the piano, leaving a room still alive with emotion and a lesson unspoken but deeply felt. The stage is set for the next part of the story, as the community begins to change subtly, and the impact of her music spreads quietly, like ripples on still water. The day of the main performance had finally arrived. The community center was filled with townspeople, volunteers, and a few curious newcomers who had heard whispers about the nun and her piano. Chairs were set in rows, and the decorations gave the room a warm, festive glow. There was a quiet excitement in the air, the kind that comes from anticipation, mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread and coffee that volunteers had brought for the attendees. The atmosphere was alive, buzzing gently, though no one yet realized how remarkable the day would become. The nun arrived early, as she always did, carrying only a small satchel and moving with her usual calm, measured steps. She nodded politely to a few early arrivals but did not speak much, her attention drawn naturally to the piano at the front of the room. She set her satchel down beside it and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. The polished surface gleamed in the morning sun, and the piano seemed almost to recognize her presence. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, listening to the silence that filled the room. It was not just silence. It was expectation, the hush before a story begins. The volunteers moved about, making final adjustments to the seating and decorations, but their chatter slowly died down as they, too, sensed that something different was about to happen. The outspoken man who had joked relentlessly about atonement from the beginning of the story was there again, nervously laughing and shifting from foot to foot. He looked at the piano, then at the nun, and back again. He tried to hide his unease behind a grin, but inside, a knot of curiosity and anxiety had formed. He had never expected the quiet woman who did her tasks silently to command such attention simply by touching the keys. As more townspeople arrived, the room filled with gentle murmurs, small groups discussing the upcoming performance. Some remembered the joke from the previous days and shared it again with new arrivals, but the story now felt different. The words didn't carry the same humor. There was a sense of awe threaded through them. Everyone had heard that the nun might play, but no one truly knew what to expect. Even those who doubted felt the air shift around the piano, a subtle tension that suggested something remarkable was about to occur. Finally, the nun took her seat at the piano. The room quieted almost instinctively. Her posture was straight, her hands poised just above the keys, and she exuded a calm assurance that silenced the last whispers. She did not speak. She did not announce herself. She simply began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, delicate, as if testing the room and the ears of the listeners. But even these soft notes carried an unexpected clarity, filling the air with a warmth and emotion that settled into the hearts of those present. At first, people looked around, uncertain whether the sound they heard was really coming from her. But as the melody continued, smooth and confident, attention shifted fully to the piano. The nun played not with showiness or performance in mind, but with a deep connection to each note. Her fingers moved with a grace that suggested decades of practice, years of quiet dedication, and a profound understanding of the music she created. Each chord seemed to tell a story of patience, humility, and the quiet strength that had defined her life. The younger volunteer who had observed her practice over the previous days watched from a distance, amazed by the transformation. It was not just music. It was a presence that commanded respect without demanding it. People began to listen more intently, and the atmosphere of casual expectation gave way to one of reverent attention. Even the outspoken man, who had spent days joking about her abilities, felt a tightness in his chest as he realized he had underestimated her completely. He remembered his own words about atonement and felt a deep, unexpected pull to follow through on them. The melody grew richer and more complex. Her fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence, yet every movement was filled with tenderness and precision. The room was completely absorbed. Small children stopped fidgeting, elders leaned forward, and even those who had arrived late found themselves captivated. The music seemed to flow through the room like a river, filling corners that had been empty, lifting spirits that had been weighed down, and connecting everyone through a shared, unspoken experience. As she played, the nun's eyes occasionally lifted, briefly meeting the gazes of those who watched her. There was no arrogance in her expression, no desire for recognition. There was only the music, the notes, and the joy of sharing something deeply personal. The people in the room felt honored simply to witness it. The piano, worn and polished by years of waiting, responded to her touch as if it had been yearning for this moment, releasing the sound it had held quietly for so long. When she reached the climax of the piece, the room was completely silent, save for the music itself. The notes rose and fell, gentle and commanding at the same time, carrying a depth of feeling that words could not capture. Some listeners felt tears forming in their eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition of something rare and beautiful. The walls of the community center seemed to absorb the sound, reflecting it back with warmth and clarity that made the moment feel larger than the space itself. The final chord lingered in the air for a long moment before fading away. The room remained still, as though no one dared break the spell that had been created. Then, slowly, applause began. Tentative at first, a polite acknowledgement, but it grew steadily as more people realized the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Clapping hands filled the space, echoing against the walls and carrying the collective appreciation of a community that had underestimated the quiet nun. Even the outspoken man, whose jokes had begun the story, clapped with a reverence he could not hide, feeling humbled and inspired. The nun looked up from the piano with a small, serene smile. She did not seek praise, and she did not need it. Her joy came from the music itself, from the connection she had rekindled with the instrument, and from sharing a part of her life so intimately with others. The applause continued, people rising to their feet, some with tears glistening in their eyes, overwhelmed by the unexpected beauty they had experienced. Volunteers approached her, offering thanks, admiration, and quiet compliments. The organizer of the event spoke softly, almost afraid to break the magic of the moment. That was more than beautiful. It was unforgettable. The nun nodded, acknowledging the words without letting them change her composure. She returned to her seat for a brief moment, letting the final echoes of the music fade from her memory, knowing that she had given the gift she had meant to share. The outspoken man finally stepped forward, his face earnest. "I promised to atone if you played," he said quietly. I understand now. I will try to keep my word, and to be better in the ways I've avoided before." She smiled, gentle and accepting, and simply nodded. No words were needed beyond that. The music had already spoken volumes. People lingered long after the formal program continued, reluctant to leave the warmth and beauty that had been created. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful, and touched by a sense of gratitude and respect. The nun returned to her usual tasks, arranging chairs and helping with minor details, but the energy in the room had shifted. She carried herself with the same calm grace, yet the way people looked at her had changed. They no longer saw just a quiet helper. They saw someone with hidden depth, patience, and talent that could move hearts. As the event wound down and the last volunteers left, the nun sat alone at the piano, gently running her fingers over the keys one last time for the day. The room was quiet, still filled with the echoes of her performance. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not from applause or recognition, but from the simple truth of having shared something precious. The piano, now alive with the memory of her music, seemed to hum softly in response. Part 4 ends with the community transformed by a single performance. The room carries the lingering magic of her music, and the town is forever changed by the quiet courage and talent of one nun. The stage is set for the final part, where the lasting impact of her performance and the subtle changes in those who witnessed it will unfold. The days following the charity event were quiet but carried a subtle transformation through the town. People walked past the community center with a newfound sense of curiosity and respect, remembering the performance that had left them speechless. Even those who had doubted the nun's abilities found themselves reflecting on the experience, recalling how her music had touched something deeper within them. There was a gentle hum in the town, a quiet acknowledgement that something extraordinary had happened among them. The outspoken man, who had spent days joking about atonement, now found himself thinking differently. He arrived at the community center early one morning, carrying supplies to help with daily tasks. His steps were deliberate, slower than before, and his smile carried a softness that had been missing. He approached the nun cautiously, almost unsure how to begin. "I promise to do better," he said quietly. "I want to start today. I want to make amends for things I've ignored, for moments I didn't try." She nodded gently, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. Her acknowledgement was enough. He didn't need more. The first step had been taken and it felt significant. Other volunteers began noticing the subtle changes in him. He was more attentive, more patient, and unexpectedly willing to help without seeking recognition. The influence of the nun's music had extended beyond the audience's ears. It had reached their hearts and changed their perspective. People started to treat one another with slightly more kindness. Conversations became softer, and laughter carried a lighter, more genuine tone. The atmosphere at the community center shifted, not overnight, but with the slow persistence of a gentle tide. The nun returned to her routines with the same quiet dedication as before, yet there was a noticeable shift in how she moved through the world. She arranged chairs, folded tablecloths, and tended to the room, but now she also carried the invisible presence of acknowledgement. People watched her more attentively, not in expectation, but in respect. Children would occasionally peek at her when she passed, sensing that there was something special about her, even if they could not yet understand it. The community, in small ways, began to see her as someone who quietly carried the ability to change hearts, not through words or authority, but through her music and the courage to share it. Over the next few weeks, the piano at the community center became a place of interest and connection. People came to visit it, sometimes brushing their fingers lightly over the keys, listening to the sound that had become part of the town's memory. Occasionally, the nun would play again, not for performance or recognition, but simply to enjoy the music herself and to remind others of the beauty that could be found in quiet moments. Each time, she played with care, choosing melodies that reflected her life, her service, and the gentle wisdom she had cultivated over the years. The young volunteer who had observed her from the beginning often stayed nearby, learning from her example and understanding the depth of patience and humility that defined her actions. They realized that greatness often comes in unexpected forms, hidden beneath ordinary appearances, waiting for someone to recognize it. They also learned that encouragement, even a quiet acknowledgement, can nurture confidence and unlock hidden potential in people. Watching her was like witnessing a lesson in humanity, patience, and grace. The town slowly began to share the story, retelling the events of the charity performance with a mixture of awe and admiration. It became a tale that reminded everyone of the power of hidden talents and the importance of humility. People spoke of the nun with respect, no longer as just a quiet helper but as someone who had shown them the depth that could exist in silence. The story spread, not through exaggeration, but through sincere appreciation for the impact of her music and her quiet courage. In her own life, the nun found a renewed sense of purpose. She continued her volunteer work, tending to the community center and helping those who sought guidance or companionship. But now, she also recognized the importance of sharing her gifts, not for recognition but for connection. The piano had become more than an instrument. It was a bridge between her world and the hearts of those around her. Each note played reminded her that her quiet life, filled with service and dedication, could inspire and change people in ways she had never imagined. The outspoken man, now genuinely committed to his promise, became a more reliable presence at the community center. He helped organize events, assisted new volunteers, and sought to contribute meaningfully to the community. His transformation was not dramatic, but it was steady and noticeable. Others who had once laughed at the idea of the nun playing now recognized the importance of humility, patience, and respect. Her influence, though quiet and understated, had begun to ripple through the town in subtle but powerful ways. The younger volunteer, inspired by what they had witnessed, began learning to play the piano themselves. They spent hours sitting near her, observing her hands and listening to the gentle flow of music. She encouraged them patiently, guiding them without pressure, showing that growth comes from consistent effort, patience, and care. Slowly, their confidence grew, and they began to understand the profound connection between dedication, discipline, and the joy of sharing one's abilities. The community center itself felt alive with a new energy. The piano, once overlooked, now became a symbol of hope, patience, and the unexpected beauty in ordinary life. People visited not just to see the nun, but to feel connected to the story, to the music, and to the sense that something meaningful could emerge from quiet dedication. The center became more than a place for charity. It became a place for learning, reflection, and inspiration. As the weeks turned into months, the town changed subtly but permanently. Acts of kindness became more frequent. People listened more carefully to one another, and the value of quiet effort and patience became a shared understanding. The story of the nun and the piano became a guiding example of how one person's dedication, humility, and courage could influence an entire community. Children grew up hearing the tale, learning from it, and aspiring to carry the same respect and humility into their own lives. The nun continued her daily life, unassuming, quiet, and gentle. Yet the world around her had shifted in response to her presence. She had shown that talent need not be loud to be powerful, that courage could be found in quiet moments, and that humility could inspire more than boastfulness ever could. Her performance had become a catalyst, not for fame or recognition, but for subtle transformation, a reminder that even small acts could ripple outward and touch countless lives. The piano remained in the community center, a silent witness to the growth and change it had inspired. Its keys, once ignored and unplayed, now held memories of music that had healed, inspired, and connected people. Every note played, whether by the nun or someone else encouraged by her example, became a testament to the power of patience, dedication, and the quiet courage to share one's gifts. Years later, people still spoke of that day. The charity event, the unexpected performance, and the humble nun who changed hearts without demanding recognition became a cherished story, passed from generation to generation. The lesson endured. Talent and courage often reside in the most unassuming places, and when recognized and shared, they have the power to transform lives, communities, and even the way people see the world around them. Part 5 ends with a town forever changed, a community inspired by quiet courage, and a nun who continued her life of humble service, knowing that one simple act of sharing her music had created ripples that would last far beyond that moment. The piano, the town, and the people all carried the echoes of that gift, a reminder that even the simplest gestures, born from dedication and love, could leave a lasting impact on the world.